you that are new, Tom Murphy is a permanent, semi-permanent fixture around here. He is a retired DNR biologist with over 30 years experience working on endangered species, right when the Endangered Species Act got started. And we knew that he lived in Beaufort County, so when he retired 10 years ago, we said, we'll give Sally a break and try to lure Tom down here. And he's been working for the Trust as a consultant ever since, working on both alligators, but also helping us maintain our eagles in terms of where are they nesting, how are they doing, are they successful, etc. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to tell you about bald eagles in South Carolina.
Yeah, it's been kind of a long ride for me. I started working with eagles in 1975, and we flew for 2 years trying to locate all the nests that we could find. And if you haven't flown aerial survey in a single engine airplane to look at eagle nests, you probably haven't lived completely. It's you're basically flying around at 200 feet in the air and at stall speed in a single engine aircraft, and it gets pretty exciting. But what I want to talk about tonight is some of the natural history of bald eagles, programs that we developed in South Carolina to find out, are bald eagles going to thrive in South Carolina, or are they going to be extirpated? And some of the adaptations that bald eagles possess and why they have them. So this is the bird we're talking about. This is the adult bald eagle. Yellow eye, yellow bill, white head, white tail. This is a youngster, dark eye and dark bill. And yeah, they have an attitude at that age. And they actually do have personalities. When we're banding, you go up into the nest, and some of the chicks are aggressive, and some of them are just, as passive as they can be. But when you get up there, nothing's ever been in that nest as far as the chick is concerned, except for mom, dad, and food. So you put your hand up on the edge of the nest, and they run over and grab a finger or whatever. And then when they see how big you are, they back off and lay on their back and put their feet up to defend themselves. So they are difficult to handle, but they do have personalities and attitudes. This is a bird going through its molt at 3.5 years of age. It's got the yellow eye and almost yellow eye and the yellow bill, and it's getting its white head and tail. So this bird will be able to breed as a 4-year-old. At the time Europeans first came to North America, we estimate there were 500,000 eagles in North America. That's based on historic numbers, habitat types, densities of different habitats, but they nested from South Florida all the way up to the Arctic Circle. That's 150,000 nesting pairs in North America, and we really decimated that population. Now they were nesting coast to coast, and from, let's say, South Florida all the way up to the Arctic Circle. So one of the things people are usually aware of, the DDT had a lot to do with eagle declines, but through the years it's always been shooting mortality, and there was a real mentality of predator control that led to a lot of shooting, and it was so much that in 1940 the Eagle Protection Act was passed by Congress, and they said in the preamble it was to prevent the extirpation of the national symbol from the United States. And they were talking about the lower 48. There were still plenty of eagles up in Alaska. But it was that dire even in 1940. So DDT certainly played its role as a tipping point, but they were endangered long before that. Even in the 1960s, 60% of the eagles we found dead were shot. And by today's standard, you'd wonder, why would that ever be? But it was a different mentality then. Alaska paid 128,000 bounties on eagle carcasses from 1917 and 1952. They quit in 52 because they became a state and they had to follow federal laws which protected the eagles. But their idea was that they're eating their salmon.
That was my question.
Yeah. Say again?
They're eating salmon.
Yeah. Yeah, their salmon. And you have to realize up there, they had thousands and thousands, of eagles, so it didn't look like anything rare and endangered to them either. So that probably also played a role in it. So what led to the recovery of bald eagles? Reduced shooting mortality. Currently, around 15% of the eagles found dead or shot. These are mostly juvenile eagles. Probably involves young males out trying to find something to shoot, no matter what it is. The ban on DDT in 1972 certainly had a huge impact. The Endangered Species Act gave us interstate control over eagle carcasses, eagle products, and all that kind of thing. And then we started doing what they call hack releases. This is where you build an artificial tower, artificial nest. You bring chicks in from Florida or wherever and raise them from the time they're about 6 weeks to the time they fledge in this platform. And that's to get them, because they're going to return to that natal area. So if you don't have any eagles in the state of Georgia, you do these hack releases to reestablish a seed population, which attracts more eagles and more eagles till you recover the population. Nest protection was also a major thing. A lot of the people on private plantations didn't care for eagles because they chased the ducks away, and that was their primary goal. But once we explained to them what the birds were all about, what they really did, they rarely take ducks unless they're crippled or otherwise compromised. And they also did a lot of prescribed burning and stuff during the winter. And they thought the eagles just came down with the ducks and went back with the ducks. And in fact, they were nesting during the winter. We had a lot of problems with disturbance at nests. But for the most part, when we explained what eagles were doing and where they were and what they needed, we got a lot of cooperation from a lot of different people. That's about a 3-week-old eagle chick. They go from something come out of a 3-inch egg to 6.5 foot wingspan in 10 weeks. So that's your typical eagle nest. We started flying nesting surveys in 1975. We flew for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, we had located 13 nests in the entire state of South Carolina. There were no nests in Georgia. There were no nests in North Carolina. There were no nests in Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi. So we had eagles up in Maine and Nova Scotia, Chesapeake Bay, and then a couple hundred pairs in Florida, and our little 13 pairs here in South Carolina. So it was a very disjunct population. We calculated based on what we knew at the time, there was a 50-50 chance for recovery, or a 50% chance of extirpating the bird from the state entirely. And that's pretty typical nest site and size, 6 to 8 feet across. They're a platform nest. It's not like a robin or a cardinal or anything like that. It's a flat platform all the way across, and there's a little area in the center outside of a soup bowl where they actually deposit the eggs. And if you look at eagles standing, their talons almost touch each other. So you wonder, how does she get over those eggs and incubate them? Well, if you watch these eagle cams, you'll see what they do is they ball up their feet and they close their feet up and walk on their knuckles. And they go past the eggs, then lay back down because they're pushing open this flap to expose the brood patch. And one of the problems with DDT and the toxic effects of it is it causes the thinning of eggshells. It interferes with the calcium apparatus in birds, pelicans, osprey, eagles, all the fish-eating birds. And so we started flying and counting chicks. It turned out we were seeing about 1.22 chicks per nesting attempt. We figured that we needed 1 chick per nest to maintain the population, so we thought 1.22 could be a good sign. But it certainly was adequate compared to historic numbers pre-DDT. So I'd done some climbing. Yeah, I did actually used to have dark hair. And I'd done some climbing with tree spikes for red calcated woodpeckers and wood duck projects and stuff like that, but this was kind of on-the-job training. And so I went into a climbing shop up in Columbia, and they had a whole wall of climbing gear. And I walked over and I started looking at it, and I looked on the top of it. It had a big sign that says, "If you don't know what it is, you don't need it." And I didn't have a clue. So I explained to them what I was planning to do, and they informed me that, before I hit the ground from 125 feet, I had already reached terminal velocity. So the last 1 or 2 seconds was just gravy. Charles Broley was a banker in Canada. When he retired, he moved to Florida. And at age 65, he started banding eagle chicks. He banded 1,200 eagle chicks. But he used butt-end bands like you typically see on a duck or a bird, and they picked those bands off. So he had no recoveries more than 6 months after banding. So all that effort was for naught. So we use a new pop riveted band that, let me see. You can get this, pass it around. It actually has a flange on the back, and you pop rivet it onto the bird's leg, and they are retained for life. The downside of it is if somebody finds a dead eagle with a leg band of that type, they can't get it off. So they have to write down the number, and a lot of times they don't have it, so sometimes you lose information using these bands. But overall, it, of course, is a real bonus. This chick is probably a week away from fledging, from flying. We also initially used Patasia wing markers, and orange was the color for South Carolina, so every time somebody saw a wing marker with was orange, we knew it was one of ours. And we got recoveries from, all the way up into Canada and the Great Lakes and Nova Scotia. But this gave us our first information where our birds are when they're not here. They're here for about 6 months out of the year. That's what it takes to go through a reproductive cycle. Then the other 6 months, they're up and gone, probably based on where they were when they were juveniles, but they know good hunting grounds. A lot of our birds go to Chesapeake Bay. Some go all the way up to Maine and Nova Scotia. Other ones go up to Chesapeake Bay, up the Susquehanna River, up and all the way up into the Great Lakes. We also tried using these prescribed plastic leg bands. They proceeded to take those off before they ever left the nest, so that was kind of a no-brainer. C-48 was one bird we had a lot of history on. She was captured when she was 4 years old up on Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and she was fitted with the first satellite-compatible transmitter that they'd ever put on an eagle. And back then, it was all military technology. So I wasn't sure what this bird was doing. I knew she was back in the state, but her signal went from the bird up to the satellite, down to a station in Alaska, over to a military installation, and then to Johns Hopkins, and I could call Johns Hopkins and find out where she was. And I called in early one morning before we were going to fly because I wanted to check on her. We had some problems with the same instrumentation having problems on swans. They were dying of frostbite. So I wanted to check on her. It turned out after all this rigmarole, she was about a mile from my office. Unfortunately, she carried that transmitter for years, and she was hit by the Amtrak train up in Yamasee. And you can see here, early on, there was very little increases, and I'm wondering if anything was ever going to happen. We're going through all this management, trying to get all these management plans implemented on every territory in the state that we could. And they were just kind of thumping along in 12, 13, up to 17. And then all of a sudden, it started to increase about 10% per year. And we saw that sustained for 25 years. So when I retired in 2009, we had over 250 eagle territories in South Carolina.
What would it be now?
Last year, we estimated we have at least 431 documented. And I'm guessing we probably have another 100 that we just don't have any documentation on. They don't fly for them anymore, so most of what we get are reports via the internet. So
Those are singles, not nesting pairs. Are those singles?
yeah, no, it's pairs,
Pairs.
territories. So it turns out if you don't poison them with pesticides or shoot them, they do really well. Similarly, we do 2 weeks of midwinter bald eagle surveys, and that's in the first 2 weeks of January. So I get to ride around in an open boat the first 2 weeks in January and cover approximately 500 miles of habitat. And back early days, we were seeing 25 or 30, even if we were looking at hundreds of miles of survey. So they were rare. I could take a reporter out all day in a boat and not be able to show them an eagle. And now all we have to do is step out of the office and point at one. So again, these numbers really went up. The last surveys that I was aware of were over 600 birds were seen, up from 35. Eagles' eyes are renowned, and you hear the expression eagle-eyed. It turns out that's very much true. Now, I tried to get these eagles to read the eye chart, but they wouldn't do it. I thought they would at least read the big E, but no. So they looked at the physiology of the eyeball, and based on the shape of the lens of the eye, they see at about a 7 magnification, about what you see through binoculars. But maybe even more incredible, the rods and cones in an eagle eye are 5 times, almost 6 times the higher density than our eyes. And it was described to me that meant that it'd be like you or I reading the headline of a newspaper from a mile away. So you don't sneak up on eagles very often. The other end of the eagle are the talons and the feet. And when you spread the toes like that, you hear a clicking sound, and that's because their tendons in their toes are in a housing. And when they close down, that's the relaxed position. They have to actually actively open their foot. So they could stay like that for hours and be no strain at all to them. So that's a little bit different. You can see also the little bumps, those little areas there, they lock up against the fish scales so they can hold a slippery fish easily. So again, various adaptations that make an eagle an eagle. And yes, those feet are very, very strong. We had a veterinarian in Florida who was operating on an eagle, and it reached over and grabbed his hand and put a talon through his palm and out the top of his hand. He told me later that if the Audubon people weren't there, he would put the bird on the floor and stepped on its head. So what are some of the things that drive selection in eagles? Nest size is real important. It's the largest bird nest in North America. Recruitment is an important part of how things operate, and our banding allowed us to look at some of that recruitment. And winter nesting seems kind of odd that almost 80% of the eagle eggs are laid the last 2 weeks in December and the first 2 weeks in January. So they're incubating eggs in the coldest time of the year. In case of eagle nest, size does count. The nest on the left, that was after Hurricane Hugo. And those birds actually built that nest in 2 different trees and just laced them together because there were no other trees standing. So it does make a difference. Average eagle nest is 6 to 8 feet across, 6 to 8 feet top to bottom. The largest one that was ever measured was up in Ohio, and it was 13 feet across and 26 feet from top to bottom. When that nest fell, they weighed it, and it was over 2,000 pounds of sticks. And if you watch the eagle cams this time of year, the male will bring in a stick and he'll put it on the nest over here. And she immediately goes over, grabs it, and puts it where she wants it. And we don't know how many sticks he has to bring before they have sex, but we know it's a lot. So the real deal there is, you have to have a nest that's large enough. The incubation starts when she lays the first egg. So there may be a week difference in the age of the first chick and the second chick, and another week to the third chick. So you're talking about at 4 weeks and 3 weeks, so it's a really huge difference. And the one will kill the other, which is common in a lot of the eagle species throughout the world, unless that nest is large enough for the smaller chick to get out of pecking distance. So that's critically important early on. But it also, when they start to grow, now you've got two chicks, each has got a 6.5-foot wingspan, and they're exercising, trying to build up the pectoral muscles and slapping each other around, and then mom or dad comes back in, so a lot of confusion. So that nest really does have to be a substantial size. We also think it probably reduces competition as far as other eagles coming in. They see that nest, they know it's going to be defended, so they go around it. On the other hand, it can be a signpost. When one of the adults dies, they will recruit in a replacement, and that nest and a single adult certainly is an attraction to replace a mate. These days, we've seen eagles where we know we had mortality, and that bird would be replaced in 2 weeks. Back when I started, we had a nest at Hunting Island, had a single adult for 4 years. There's 13 feet of eagle flapping. This is what we call the limbing stage. What they're doing is they'll hold on to the nest or to a limb, and they'll flap like crazy because they're trying to build up those pectoral muscles. And every once in a while, they'll turn loose and they'll go up in the air about 2 feet. They'll come back down and crunch back down in the nest like, that's a bad idea. Not sure about this flying stuff. And actually, when they leave the nest, they can fly really well. What they can't do is land very well. So they'll fly around and they'll look wonderful, and then they'll go to land in a pine tree and klutz up and fall to the ground. And very embarrassing. There was a case in Georgia, the first eagle hacking project they had an elderly couple that were feeding these birds. They would climb this ladder, put fish in a sliding drawer so that the eagles didn't see them, and then close the drawer and eagles. And they've been doing this for weeks and weeks. And because it was the first one, they had all the TV cameras out there. And when they get up to be 8 weeks old or 10 weeks old, they'll take the cage off the front that was protecting them from other predators. And so everybody was waiting for these 2 eagle chicks to fly and look glorious and all that kind of thing with the cameras rolling. And for the longest time, they just sat there and didn't do anything. And finally, one walked out onto the perch and launched and flew, and everybody was happy and everything, and it flew around for a while, and it came back down and tried to land into a tree. It missed the limb in the tree and fell in the marsh, and the alligator ate it. A little bit of a math lesson here. The ideal situation is for a 4-year-old eagle to pair with an experienced adult where the bird of the same sex has died in the interim. And we know from our banding, we followed all the birds we banded that nested back in South Carolina. It told us 2 things. It told us if they fled in South Carolina, they're very likely to nest in South Carolina as adults. They don't just randomly disperse. It also told us that they did nest as 4-year-olds when they first get the white head and tail. A lot of confusion. Had a lot of captive eagles up at Patuxent that didn't get their white head and tail till they were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. So we weren't really sure, but it's pretty sustained now. It's 3.5 years is when you're going to get that white head and tail. 13% of our banded birds disappear each year. So we have a 13% annual mortality in our eagles. We need 13% replacement every year. And the life expectancy for an individual eagle is only 6 to 7 years. A lot of this is due to high juvenile mortality. Of the birds we banded, we had 5 or 6 that actually made it over 20 years, and one that made it to be 26. But the only way you lose a territory, not the individual birds, but the territory, is for both of the adults to die in the same year. So that's a square of 0.13 or 1.69. So only 1.69% of territories are lost in any given year. So once you have a territory, you're going to have eagles for a long time. Based on those calculations of 13% mortality rates, we estimate that the average life expectancy of a territory is 41 years, and that 10 or 15% of the territories will last more than 100 years. And those numbers were so oh my, we started thinking, is that really true, or we just not looking at things right? So we went back, and after 40 years, 12 of the 13 original territories were still in existence. And we had one territory on the Cooper River, it was on Middleburg Plantation, that we knew had been active since 1933. Wow. So these birds do, when these territories form, they really are going to be around for a long time. That's why when we got a new territory here last year, I thought that was really cool. It's nice to have the birds back, but when you get a new territory, you're going to have birds to look at for a long time. When the eagles come back this time of year, if the male gets back before the female or vice versa, they'll start to recruit in a replacement. Then when mom gets back or dad gets back, the established territory, usually there's a bit of a brawl going on. And so we get a lot of injured eagles from eagle-on-eagle encounters this time of year. And we rehab those birds when we can. And I put the magic marker dots on their snouts so we could tell if they showed up back in the territory. And apparently we always pick up the loser, because we've never seen one of these birds that lost the fight back on the territory. Of course, the question always is, why in the world do you nest in the wintertime? Well, waterfowl are in, that's a source of food for eagles, but more than that, the coots are. The water clarity is better. It's not all greened up from algae and stuff, so the visibility of fish is better. The fish are a little bit slower in the winter than they're going to be in the summer, and you get a lot of carrion to eat from cold stress for mammals dying, and eagle nesting is synchronous with the anadromous fish runs. These are the shad and herring runs of ocean fish are coming up to spawn in fresh water, and wherever you are on the East Coast, whenever that spawn occurs in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, all the way up to Maine, those eagle chicks are going to be about 5 to 6 weeks old, have the greatest caloric demand, so they've obviously keyed into that rich food source. And they're asynchronous with other raptors, so they're not competing with osprey for fish or anything else. There's not a lot of territorial disputes between species, but it's not the way it used to be. We don't have the fish runs we used to have. We don't have the waterfowl that we used to have. So I'm not sure we'll ever get back to the huge numbers that were recorded historically. And there's an eagle. I lost my pointers. Sitting in the nest, snow all the way around. And she was successful raising chicks that year. They had another nest that's up in West Virginia. She was sitting on eggs when she had 3 foot of snow on her. And the only thing you could see was her beak. And she eventually just got up, shook everything off, and went about her business, raised her chicks, and did fine. They are generalists. They eat a lot of different stuff. They eat a lot of fish, but they also eat birds, mammals, reptiles, and carrion. Different pairs specialize. I had a pair that we banded for a number of years. They always had white ibis feathers and feet in the nest. Had another one that specialized on coots all the time. Another one that, I forget what they were taking. But each bird, each pair, they learn whatever habitat they're in order to feed on enough to get by. They currently have a wide distribution. They nest in every state of the union except for Hawaii. And in some areas they're very high density. It was estimated in the Chesapeake Bay alone there was once 3,000 eagle nests. They're back up to over 1,000 now. We refer to coots as eagle burgers. When an eagle flies over a bunch of coots, they all bunch up into a real tight raft. And when they go over ducks, the ducks get up and fly, so they're not really available. It's much more difficult for an eagle to catch a flying duck than it is for a coot sitting on the water. And they'll circle around those coots, and the coots will dive. And when they start to come up, they'll dive on them again. And after about 4 or 5 times, that coot can't dive anymore. It comes up panting, and the eagle just plucks it off the surface of the water. We actually, when we were working with coots, we did that using a boat to run the coots down, and then throw tennis balls at it when it came back up. And after about 3 or 4 times, you go over and just dip net it. So it's the same philosophy for the eagles. Of course, the coots, meanwhile, are trying to protect themselves. This particular group, I could watch the birds on the outside, knew they were vulnerable. They were climbing over the backs of the ones on the inside. It looked like a washing machine. Just this constant flow of coots going over each other. Ben Franklin didn't want the eagle as the national emblem or national bird. Said it was a bird of low moral character because it ate carrion, it ate dead stuff. But you have to remember, in an evolutionary sense, they were evolving when we had 4 to 6 million bison. That's 4 to 6 million tons, and a lot of winter mortality, providing lots and lots for eagles to eat. Right now, all the deer in North America account for only 1/100th of that biomass. So it was a very strong selection pressure. They do feed on dead stuff. I also used to get calls. I even had my boss call, said, this person called and said this eagle's eating his dead dog on the side of the road. And I asked him, what do you want me to do? I could scold him, but I don't think it's going to change anything. But the downside of that is they do feed on roadkills, and that's led to a lot of vehicle collisions. 6 of the first 8 rehabs we got this year were vehicle strikes. So I'm one of the nut jobs that goes around dragging deer carcasses off the highway and putting them away from the road so the eagles don't get hit. Again, the hack release, we found out that eagle chicks do not need mom and dad to teach them how to fish, how to hunt, or anything. It's all instinctive. So they're very able to take care of themselves. Actually, the hack release is a falconry term. Falconers, if they took a bird, a peregrine falcon or an eagle or whatever, from a nest and raised it, it would never fly like a wild bird. So what they would do is they would put bells on their legs and feed them in the same place, on what they call a hack platform, for weeks. And once they got really used to that, then they would take the jesses off and let them fly free for a few weeks, gain their skills. Then when they come back to the hack platform, they'd recapture them and then man them as falconry birds. So there's no teaching involved, but if you think about it now, when eagles fledge, when the chicks fledge, they're fed by the adults for another 4 to 6 weeks. They don't make any attempt at catching anything during that whole time. So here for 4 to 6 weeks, this big bird has been coming in and giving you fish, and eventually they're taking the fish. They'll fly to the adults and take the fish away. About the time mom and dad leave, the osprey are coming in the nest. Here's a big bird with a fish. Well, that must be mine too. So you see a lot of activity, and this is the whole idea that they're low moral character because they steal from the osprey. And they do indeed do that. And it's kind of interesting to watch. What they do is they'll come up and fly underneath the osprey. And instinctively, the osprey will try to stay on top, so it'll start to climb and climb and climb. When it gets up high enough, the eagle will close on it. The osprey will drop the fish and turn to defend itself. And most of the time, the eagle can catch that fish before it gets to the water. Unlike osprey, when eagles get wet in the water, they can't fly. They have to swim out. And they come out and they look like this, and they're looking around everywhere like, did anybody see that? The real reason is that if anybody is going to attack them, it's going to be now, and there's nothing they can do about it when they're wet like that. So they're really aware of their surroundings when they come out. An osprey can plunge dive, but it has a wing articulation that they can pick their wings up out of the water, shake them, and then fly out. Eagles can't do that.
Will an eagle drown?
Eagles have drowned, but normally no. They have so much buoyancy because of the feathers that they literally swim with their wings to come to shore. If they catch a fish and it's big enough it drops them in the water, they won't let go of that fish. They'll swim out with the fish in their foot and then eat it. Of course, when we started, we were doing our banding. Sometimes it took hours to get into a nest site because they were in such remote areas. And we thought, well, these are just birds that don't prefer not to be around people. But the fact was, if they were around people, they were getting shot. So the ones that were left were in very remote areas. But as the population recovered, we started seeing more and more eagles around people. And I knew we were things were changing when I got a call from a woman at Hilton Head complaining that the eagles were dropping sticks on her Mercedes. And now we have a lot of eagle nests that are on, around playgrounds and all kind of places like that. So as long as you don't shoot them, they do pretty well around people and can adapt to it. This is on James Island. This is up here. They're building 6 soccer fields, and immediately next to this nest. So they had soccer games and people out there by the hundreds, carrying on and everything during the nesting season. This pair went right on raising chicks. But then, when one of the adults died, the other bird could not find a replacement. The bird wouldn't come into that situation, not being habituated to it over years. So eventually, the single bird stayed there until it died, and then the territory was lost. Again, winter nesting. Make sure I've got it right. Yeah, the egg on the left is a wooden egg. The one on the right is actual eagle egg. And that yellow thing is a temperature data recorder. And it gets programmed on the computer to take a temperature every minute and a half. And it can record 30,000 temperatures before it has to be downloaded. And we'd put it in a wooden egg, and then we would wait for at least a week of incubation. If you disturb eagles in that first week of incubation, they'll abandon that clutch. But if you wait till after that, you could put this wooden egg with the temperature data logger underneath her incubating, and she didn't care. That was fine with her. 2 eggs, 3 eggs, 4 eggs. She's going to do her thing. And that gave us what we call an incubation profile. And up at the top, you see that's the egg in the nest. She's keeping that regardless of the day-night temperature changes. She's keeping those eggs up around 90 degrees. And very consistently. And the white one is a data logger at the base of the nest tree that's out in the environment, not being incubated, obviously. So they're on their eggs 24/7 for 35 days. It takes them to hatch. And then another 4 weeks, they're brooding the chicks. So it's a pretty big operation. This is another situation out at Nemours Wildlife Foundation, one of their nests. They did find, and one of the birds got sick or injured or whatever, wasn't doing real well, then it died. And she tried to incubate, as a single adult, but you really can't do that. And eventually she just abandoned. You can see everything goes back to ambient temperatures after she abandons. But you can actually look at real details, taking the temperature every minute and a half. And this was an osprey, but you can see she was off her eggs for 2 hours and 46 minutes. And that was still a successful nest. So that gives us a lot of detailed information of, what stresses the eggs, how long can they do this, do that. It turns out that in most cases, eagles' eggs or osprey eggs or bird eggs are very resilient when they're first laid. It isn't until the embryo starts to develop in the egg that they become very sensitive, because now you're dealing with a bird, not just with an egg. This is Jim Elliott. He runs the Center for Birds of Prey up in Allendale, just north of Mount Pleasant. If you ever get a chance to visit there, make a point of doing it. It's a fantastic facility. Jim came to me 27 years ago and asked if we needed a rehab center in Allendale. And I asked him, well, what do you do for a living? And he said, oh, I'm a real estate agent. And I thought, no, this ain't going to work. We had a lot of people who wanted to play with injured birds, and there's a long learning curve, and by the time they got to where they were competent, they didn't want to do it anymore because all the fun and games had gone out of it, and now it's work. But Jim has a state-of-the-art facility. It's one of the top raptor centers in the world. I guess, and it's probably $5 or $6 million worth of facilities right now. I think they have 80 different species of raptors on display there. So it's a pretty fabulous place. And like I said, we had a lot of problems with shooting. You can see the pellets on the left. The one down on the wing, that's repairable. But the one up there in the joint, that bird will never fly again. So it really makes a difference. But even on the one on the lower part of the wing, you have to measure the other wing and make sure that when it's repaired, it's exactly the same as the other one. If it's off more than 1/4 of an inch, that bird will never fly again. So eagle rehab is a real specialty, and the Raptor Center does it better than anybody I know. I always told the clinical people up there, if I ever broke my arm, I'd come up there because I get much better care there than I would in Beaufort. About the time we thought we'd, got to a point where we understood eagles and what problems we were having, we started getting eagles that were either sick or dead in landfills. And we started looking at it. I didn't think it would be a big problem. I thought it was a rarity. But what was happening was they were scavenging on euthanized pets. So they were getting secondary barbiturate poisoning. And initially, I didn't think it was a big deal. But after we got into it, virtually every landfill has this problem. And we've worked with the landfill people. They've been very cooperative. Now when the shelters bring hundreds of dogs or cats or whatever that have been euthanized, they bury them in a different part of the landfill, and they bury them deeper so that the black vultures and the coyotes and the dogs can't dig them up. So resolved a lot of that problem, but not all of it. There's still dogs that are coming in the dumpsters and stuff like that. And it was also a long learning curve, what disturbs eagles while they're nesting and how much can they tolerate. This is when they were 4-laning Highway 17 across the Combahee River. And the nest is about 30 yards to the right of that vehicle there. And we had an observer that was hired that watched the territory. And they didn't have any problem with trucks coming in and doing everything. The only thing that bothered those eagles was when the dump trucks would dump a load, they would slam their tailgate to clear the dirt, and that would freak them out. They get off the nest every time that happened. So we started telling no slamming tailgates, no slamming doors, no Jake brakes, no horns, and
worse than people.
electrocution is also a problem with eagles. SC and G, anytime we have an eagle electrocution, they'll reconfigure that particular site until it is eagle friendly. Most of the new lines you see going up, they have hanging insulators, and they're virtually bird proof. We don't see electrocutions on those. They don't retrofit everything like that, but everything that's new is going to that new configuration, which is much more bird friendly. An electrocution in a bird is pretty horrific, and sometimes they survive the event, but then when you bring them in, everything between, say, the wingtip where it went in and the foot where it came out, that whole area will decay over the next couple of weeks and rot. So there's almost nothing you can do with a bird that's been electrocuted. As of 2006, we had a little over 200 eagle nesting territories. You can see primarily on the coast, about 80% eagle nests on the lower coast, but they're now colonizing a lot of the inland reservoirs. We have 491,000 acres of man-made inland reservoirs. That's 491,000 acres of eagle habitat, potentially. And we're seeing them start to do that, particularly on Marion and Moultrie. We probably have close to 100 pairs on those two lakes now, which it's very fortunate that they've controlled the hydrilla that grows in those two reservoirs, and I'll explain that about this. AVM and eagles. AVM stands for avian vacuolar melanopathy. And it was a disease that was first described out in Arkansas. And they had coots that were starting to act funny. And then all of a sudden the eagles would start acting funny. They're hanging by one foot up in the tree upside down. They were unable to fly eventually. And they brought them into rehab and they all died. There was no rehabilitation possible. So they asked me to bring the bald eagle recovery team out to Arkansas to have a meeting so they could show us what the problem was, and we would miraculously tell them what their problem was. Of course, we did that, and we had no idea what was going on. And so all the members got back, and because we had seen sick coots and sick eagles, we started seeing those sick birds in South Carolina, in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Florida. So we knew it was more widespread than we once thought. And the culprit basically here is hydrilla. It's a submerged aquatic plant imported from Southeast Asia. It was became introduced mostly through the aquarium trade, where it was used in aquarium. People got their fish died or they got tired of them, they dump everything out into the water, and then this hydrilla would take over. It's a very aggressive plant. It can grow from 30 feet down to the surface. It can stop a 17-foot Boston whaler in about 6 feet. So it's really remarkable. But what's happening, we eventually found, is that there's a blue-green algae that grows on the hydrilla, and it produces a toxin in the fall of the year. And that's in response to cooling temperatures, and they're trying to defend themselves from diatoms taking over. So they produce this toxin. The coots eat the toxin, they get sick, and vacuolar melanopathy simply means that the myelin sheath of the central nervous system is getting ulcers in it, getting blisters and rupturing. So they lose all their ability to fly, even to stay right side up. And so I asked all of our waterfowl people, let me know if you see any coots acting goofy. And they said, all coots act goofy. But we did start seeing it here. Lake Thurmond was one of the hot spots. We were recovering 10 to 15 eagles every year up there. The first year we had AVM disease up there, all the nesting stopped. Every bird was dead. So it's a very lethal disease. But since then, we've made a lot of progress. We didn't know what the blue-green was. Had a colleague that was working on algal blooms on Kiowa Island. It was in our Marine Division, Susan Wild, and she came out on 2 field trips, and after the second field trip, she came down to my office and says, I think I know what it is. And we had everybody in the nation from, the National Health Center and the veterinary centers and the University of Georgia, all trying to figure out what this was going on, and she figured it out in about 2 weeks. But she told me that, she knows it's this blue-green algae, it grows on the underside of the leaves, but she wasn't sure if it was a Haplosiphon or a Stignomentales genus. And I said, Susan, I can only learn 10 big words. And refrigerator and mayonnaise were already taken. And she came back a couple of weeks later and said, just call it mayo and fridge, I got more big words for you. But after all this effort all over the place, she was the one that actually figured out what the organism was. She went on to actually name this new algal species. So the risk factors, like I say, in Lake Thurmond, all the nesting went away. And eagles, usually within 5 miles of an outbreak, were at risk. If you're on the same river drainage, you're at risk because most eagles will feed up and down a riverine system. So we're seeing localized effects, but not overall. Disease kills quickly, so the opportunity to observe birds with symptoms is very limited. By the time they're symptomatic, they're going to be dead in days. So, and carcasses are consumed. We put out a bunch of coot carcasses, and they virtually were all gone within a week. So, again, the opportunity to see the mortality in coots was very limited. And a lot of times, sick eagles will seek heavy cover, and some of them will travel tens or even hundreds of miles from where they contracted the disease before they die. So very hard to locate the mortality. Only 12% of eagles that are abandoned are ever recovered. So that gives you an idea of recovery rates. So finding 10 dead eagles probably represents 100 or more dead birds. It certainly had a significant effect on local populations or even in a watershed, but it hasn't reversed the recovery in any of the southeastern states, including South Carolina. There are problems when you think about if it went out to some of the reservoirs in Arkansas where they overwinter 1,000 plus eagles. If they get hydrilla out there and get the blue-green out there, we could be talking about hundreds and hundreds of eagle mortalities. So we're still looking at that particular problem, and still got some concerns about it. Fortunately, Lake Merritt and Moultrie, they got all the hydrilla out of those reservoirs, so we have lots of nesting up there. But that cost them $12 million, so it's not a simple feat. But right now, we're hoping that eagles are going to continue to fly and continue to produce chicks. And I'll close with this picture, which I think is just terrific. We had all the 5th graders from Hilton Head Island out to look at 2 big eagle chicks in a nest on the golf course. And for some reason, you have to scrunch up your face to look through a spotting scope. And what caught my eye was a young lady in pink. She'd look, and then she'd put the binoculars down, and she'd look, and put the binoculars down. She's kind of backwards. And crazy thing was, I gave a talk at Hilton Head, and this woman came up to me afterwards and says, "That's Patty Ann, my granddaughter." So anyway, I opened it up to questions.